There's a particular kind of silence that only exists on the frontier after a storm. Not peaceful, not quiet, waiting. I've been keeping a personal log since 1887, not because anyone asked me to, not because I thought my life was worth recording, but because my father told me once that a man who doesn't write down what he sees will one day convince himself he never saw it. I thought that was the ramblings of a drunk. Now I'm not so sure. I've written about droughts that lasted 3 summers. I've written about the Haskell fire that took 11 horses and 2 good men. I've written about the winter of '89 when the creek froze solid enough to drive a wagon across, and we did, because we were fools and desperate in equal measure. But I've never written anything like what I'm about to write. Because what happened that night? The night 4 Apache girls appeared at the edge of my fence line in the rain, shaking, barefoot, and holding each other like the world was actively trying to pull them apart. That's not the kind of story you tell around a fire. That's not the kind of story you tell at all, really, unless you're trying to explain something that doesn't have a clean explanation. By sunrise, something had changed. Not just on my land, not just in my house. And I'm still not entirely sure whether that's a good thing. I don't know what time it was exactly when I heard the sound. Late past midnight, probably. The kind of late where the night has stopped pretending it's going to relent and just settles into itself like a man who's decided he's staying. The rain had been coming down since around 8 o'clock. Not violent, not theatrical, just relentless. The way this land gets when it wants to remind you that you're a guest and it's never fully accepted your terms. I was in the barn. Not sleeping, I hadn't slept well in weeks, and the barn had become a habit I couldn't explain to myself. Something about the smell of the horses, the way the rain on the roof created a kind of rhythm you could almost follow, almost trust. I had my log open across my knee, the lantern angled low enough that Dusty, my oldest mare, 17 and increasingly suspicious of my insomnia, wouldn't get spooked by the light. I was writing about the fence on the north pasture. 3 posts had rotted through, and I'd been meaning to replace them since July. Practical things, useful things, the kind of writing that doesn't ask you to feel anything. Then I heard it. It wasn't a sound I could immediately categorize, which is probably why it made the hair on my arms go up before my brain caught up. Animals make sounds you learn. Wind makes sounds you learn. This was, I wrote it down in the margin of that page, almost involuntarily, the way you do when something happens before you've decided whether it matters, like a person trying not to be heard while being terrified. I set the log down on the hay bale beside me. Dusty lifted her head. I picked up the lantern and walked to the barn door and stood there for a moment, listening to the rain. Nothing. Then again, closer, from the direction of the north fence, the one with the 3 rotted posts, the one I hadn't fixed. I stepped out into the rain. I want to be honest about something here, because the log demands honesty even when I'd rather it didn't. My first thought wasn't concern. My first thought was the word coyotes, followed quickly by the word thieves, and I went back for my rifle before I went any further. That's not a confession I make proudly. But the frontier has a way of conditioning you, and I'd been conditioned well. I came around the side of the barn, rain hitting my hat in a steady pour, and walked the 30 yards to the north fence, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other, and what I saw made me stop so suddenly I almost lost my footing in the mud. 4 girls. Standing at the fence line, or rather, huddled against it, pressed together in a way that made them look like a single organism at first, a shadow that breathed. When the lantern light reached them, they didn't run, which surprised me, but they didn't move toward me either. They just stilled, like rabbits who'd already decided that freezing was the only card left to play. Apache, I knew that within a second or two. The clothing, or what remained of it, blankets wrapped and tied in the way I'd seen in the years when the San Carlos people still moved through this region freely, before the corralling, before the long arguments in Washington that filtered down to us as policy and confusion. Their hair, dark and straight, plastered flat against their faces by the rain. Moccasins that had given up any pretense of waterproofing. 4 girls, no older than I struggled to assess, the light being what it was, the rain being what it was. The youngest couldn't have been more than 10. The oldest maybe 16, 17 at a generous estimate. No adults. No horses. Nothing. I stood there in the rain with my rifle lowering by degrees as my brain worked through the inventory of what I was looking at. And the oldest girl, the one who was, I would come to understand, making every decision for this group, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as controlled desperation. Like she had a very specific amount of pride left, and she was going to spend it as carefully as possible. She said something in Apache. I don't speak Apache. I spoke some Navajo once years ago, enough to buy horses and not start arguments, but that was a long time and a different territory. She seemed to understand, from my blank expression, that we didn't share a language, and there was a flicker of something across her face. Frustration, maybe, or the exhaustion of a problem that just got harder. Then she looked at my barn, then at me, then at the rain, though that seemed almost rhetorical. I said, all right. I don't know why I said it so quickly. I've thought about that since. My log doesn't explain it because I wrote all right and then nothing else for 3 pages, as if the moment refused to be annotated. But I said it, and I stepped back from the fence, and I angled the lantern toward the barn door, and I waited. The oldest girl looked at the others. Some kind of assessment happened that I wasn't privy to, fast, silent, conducted entirely in glances. Then she moved, the others followed. They came through the gap in the fence where the rotted post had fallen. One of them, the second oldest, maybe 14, with a cut above her left eyebrow that had stopped bleeding but hadn't fully closed, stumbled slightly in the mud, and the youngest one caught her elbow without looking, without breaking stride, and I noted that detail for reasons I couldn't articulate. I led them to the barn. Dusty watched us come in with the calm suspicion of a horse who has seen many things and reserves judgment on all of them. I set the lantern on the center post and turned around. In the light, they were younger than they'd seemed and more damaged. The youngest one's feet were in a state that made my chest tighten involuntarily. Not just wet, raw in places. The kind of raw that comes from distance, from surfaces that weren't made for human feet and hours that weren't made for human endurance. The one with the cut above her eyebrow was favoring her left arm, not dramatically but consistently, the way you do when you've learned that demonstrating pain is a vulnerability you can't currently afford. The oldest girl, she had a quality to her face that I can only call watchfulness. Not fear exactly, not aggression, just awareness. She was cataloging the barn the same way I'd been cataloging them, exits, hazards, resources. I pointed to the hay on the far side of the barn, away from the horses. I mimed sitting, which felt absurd but produced results. The youngest one sat down immediately, with the total physical relief of someone whose body has been waiting for permission. The others followed more cautiously. I went to the tack room and found the wool blankets I kept there, 4 of them, which felt like either coincidence or the universe making a point, and brought them back. The oldest girl watched me approach with the blankets, and I set them down a careful distance away and stepped back, because something about her posture said space is a requirement, not a preference. She picked up the nearest blanket, handed it to the youngest without looking at her, picked up the second one and hesitated, looked at me. I said, go ahead, pointed at the blankets. They're yours. She couldn't understand the words. But she seemed to understand something, because after a moment she took the blanket and wrapped it around the girl with the cut eyebrow first, then herself. 4 blankets, 4 girls. I hadn't done it deliberately. I'm not sure what that means. I sat down on a hay bale on my side of the barn's invisible line and opened my log and wrote, 4 Apache girls, North Fence, after midnight. I don't know what happened to bring them here, and I'm not certain I have a right to ask. I closed the log. Outside, the rain continued. I want to say I slept, but that would be the kind of lie that insults both the log and the reader. I didn't sleep. I sat on that hay bale with the lantern turned down to its lowest useful flame, and I listened to the barn breathe, and I watched without trying to be obvious about it. The youngest one fell asleep within minutes. I could tell by the change in her breathing. She went from shallow and controlled to deep and unguarded with the abruptness of a child who has been holding themselves upright through willpower alone and simply ran out. The oldest one noticed and reached over and tucked the blanket more firmly around her shoulders with a gesture so practiced it had become muscle memory, and I thought, she's done this before. Many times. This is not new territory for her. The one with the cut eyebrow, I'll call her the second one, for the log's purposes, stayed awake longer. She sat with her back against the barn wall and her good arm around her knees and looked at the lantern with an expression I couldn't read. Not vacant, not afraid, something more complicated. Contemplative, maybe, in the way of someone who has been given an unexpected and temporary respite from something ongoing and doesn't quite know what to do with the pause. The fourth one, quieter than the others in a way that went beyond silence, a kind of internalized quiet, had taken the blanket and folded herself into the far corner of the hay with the smallest physical footprint I'd ever seen a person achieve. She was facing the wall. I couldn't see her expression at all. I made a note about her in the log and then crossed it out, because whatever was happening in that corner felt private in a way I didn't have the right to observe and record. The oldest girl did not sleep. She sat at the edge of the group, between them and me, which was not accidental, with her blanket around her shoulders and her eyes moving at regular intervals. The barn door, the horses, my hands, the barn door again. I recognized the rotation. I'd done it myself years ago in places that weren't safe. It's a kind of vigilance that becomes involuntary once you've needed it long enough. And the fact that she was still running it here, in the relative shelter of my barn, told me something about how recently she'd needed it, and how uncertain she still was that she didn't. At some point, maybe 2 in the morning, maybe later, she looked directly at me. Not the scanning look, a direct one, intentional. I held her gaze. She said something in Apache, quiet, not aggressive, almost, I'm going to write the word and accept that I can't verify it, almost polite. Like she was making an introduction that circumstances had prevented until now. I said, Cal. I touched my chest, because it seemed like the thing to do. She looked at my hand on my chest. Then she said a word. It was short, and the sound of it was nothing like anything I'd call a name, but the way she said it and the way she touched her own collarbone immediately after told me what it was. I wrote it phonetically in the log. I won't write it here, because I'm not confident my phonetics did it any justice, and she deserves better than a mangled version of her name in a cowboy's notes. I said, okay. She said something else longer, and I shook my head to indicate I didn't understand, and she made a gesture that took me a moment to parse, her hand flat, fingers together, moving horizontally from her right to her left, like she was describing a journey, a long one. I nodded. She pointed at the youngest girl, the sleeping one, and made a smaller version of the same gesture. Same direction. Different starting point, I thought, or maybe the same starting point and a longer time ago. Then she made a gesture I did understand, her hands together like prayer, but not exactly prayer. More like a thing that no longer existed, a place that was gone. I sat with that for a while. The rain eased around 3 o'clock, not stopping but losing its certainty. I got up, carefully, announcing my movement with deliberate slowness, and went to the tack room and came back with a tin of hardtack and a canteen. I set them at the edge of the invisible line and went back to my bale. The oldest girl looked at the food, then at me. Then she called the second one's name, softly, a different tone than she'd used for anything else, something warmer in the edges, and the second one looked up from wherever her thoughts had been, and the oldest girl gestured toward the food. The second one hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then she took the hardtack and broke it without ceremony, and woke the youngest with a gentle touch on the shoulder, and handed her a piece before she'd even fully opened her eyes. The fourth one in the corner didn't move. The oldest girl, after everyone else had eaten, took the last piece. She ate it without looking at me, which I think was a kind of courtesy, a way of eating that didn't require acknowledgement. I wrote in the log, hardtack. They ate it like it had been a while. The one in the corner didn't turn around. I don't know what that means. I closed the log again. Dusty sighed from her stall. Outside, something moved in the scrub, a possum, probably, or a night bird, bothered by the easing rain. The youngest girl fell back asleep with a piece of hardtack still in her hand. The oldest girl looked at her for a long moment with an expression that made something in my sternum feel like it was contracting. And then she very carefully removed the hardtack from the sleeping girl's hand and set it on the blanket where she'd find it in the morning. I added that to the log. And then I sat in the quiet and the low lantern light and tried to understand what I was looking at. Here's what I knew. As of 3 in the morning, sitting in my barn with 4 Apache girls in various states of exhaustion and distress. I knew that this region had been complicated, to use the word that newspapers preferred. The word I'd have used was broken. The agreements that were supposed to govern who could go where and who had the right to what had been renegotiated and re-renegotiated until they meant nothing. And the people who'd been there before me, before all of us, before the wire and the branded cattle and the men in Washington drawing lines on maps, had been pushed and contracted and pressed into situations that the men drawing those lines had convinced themselves were solutions. I'd watched it happen from the fence line mostly. That's not a proud admission. I knew that there were Apache families scattered through these territories, some in accordance with whatever the current agreements were, many in defiance of them, many in the gray zones between agreement and defiance where most of actual human life tends to occur. I knew that the Army had a presence at Fort Bowie that had recently become more active, more certain of its mandate, more inclined to interpret ambiguity as a problem to be resolved through presence and authority. I did not know what had happened to bring these 4 girls to my fence line at midnight in a rainstorm. But I was beginning to develop a shape of a hypothesis, and the shape of it made my stomach feel unwell. I made myself not ask. I made myself write instead. What I can do right now is make sure they're warm and fed. That's the boundary of what's useful. Everything else is tomorrow's problem. This is a logic I've applied many times in my life. It's a logic with limits. I discovered one of those limits around 4 in the morning, when the 4th girl, the quiet one, the one facing the wall, began very softly to cry. Not loud, not theatrical. The kind of crying that happens when you think no one is aware of you and you've been holding it for so long that holding it any longer is simply no longer physiologically possible. The kind of crying that is really a release valve rather than a communication. I looked at the oldest girl. She was already looking at the 4th one. Her face had done something, shifted, rearranged, in a way that I want to describe precisely because I've never seen it in a face quite that way before. It was the expression of someone who carries something heavy, and has been carrying it so long they no longer notice the weight, except in moments when they look at someone else carrying the same thing and suddenly remember what it costs. She moved over to the corner without a word, sat down behind the 4th girl, put one arm around her from behind, not demanding or performative, just present, available, a body that said, I know, I know, I know. The 4th girl cried for about 4 minutes by my estimation. The oldest girl sat there the whole time, saying nothing, looking at the barn wall over the 4th girl's shoulder. I looked at my log. I didn't write anything. Some things resist the log. I've learned that this is not a failure of the log, it's a quality of the thing. By the time the sky outside the barn door began to separate from black into a deep gray, that first hint of suggestion before actual light, before the birds have decided anything, the youngest girl was still asleep. The 2nd one had closed her eyes, though I wasn't sure she was fully under. The 4th one had gone quiet and still, and the oldest girl was sitting back in her position at the invisible boundary line. She was looking at her hands. I'd been watching the barn door, watching the gray deepen, and I looked back at her and she was just looking at her hands. Not in a vacant way. In the way you look at your hands when you're making an inventory of what they've done and what they still need to do. I thought about my father. I thought about the log. I thought about the fence posts that needed replacing and about all the practical things that would assert themselves once morning fully arrived. Who I might need to talk to, or more importantly, who I might need to not talk to. What the presence of 4 Apache girls on my land meant in the current climate of this county, this territory, this complicated and badly managed piece. I thought about the Army at Fort Bowie. I thought about my neighbor Holt, 2 miles east, who had opinions I'd stopped arguing with because arguing with Holt was like arguing with a wall that had the additional quality of being able to vote. I thought about what this day was going to ask of me. And then I stopped thinking about any of that, because the oldest girl looked up from her hands and looked at the barn door and the gray light coming through it, and her face did something I hadn't seen it do yet. It went afraid. Not the controlled, watchful alertness from earlier, actual fear. The kind that's about a specific thing, not a general condition. Her gaze went to the sleeping youngest girl, then to the 2nd and 4th, then to me. And then she said something, and even without the language I understood it. What happens now? I looked at her for a long moment. I picked up my log and held it in my lap, a habit that's become a kind of steadying mechanism, the weight of it, the familiar texture of the cover. I said, I don't know yet. She didn't understand the words, but she seemed to understand the tone, which was honest rather than reassuring, and something in her face shifted slightly. Not relief, not satisfaction, but the particular quality of being told a hard truth by someone who bothered to tell you the truth at all. The gray outside deepened. Somewhere down the draw, a mockingbird stopped, started again, trying to decide whether the morning was worth announcing. The youngest girl turned over in her sleep and murmured something, and the oldest girl's attention went to her immediately, and she pulled the blanket straighter over the sleeping girl's shoulder with those practiced hands that had done this so many times. The morning was coming regardless. I opened the log and wrote, "Sunrise in maybe an hour, 4 Apache girls in my barn." I haven't figured out the right thing yet, but I know that wrong things come easily in situations like this, which means I need to take my time. I underlined the last part, twice. Outside, the mockingbird made up its mind. The light came slowly, the way light comes after a night of rain, cautious, feeling its way, diffusing through clouds that were thinning but hadn't given up. By the time it was genuinely morning, genuinely day, the kind of light you could work by, 3 things had happened. The youngest girl woke up, found the hardtack on her blanket, looked around with wide, uncertain eyes. The oldest girl said something to her. Her voice for the youngest girl was different from all her other voices, softer, the way voices get when you're trying to communicate safety rather than information. And the youngest girl ate the hardtack slowly and looked at the horses with the particular interest of a child who is afraid and also, despite everything, still curious. The second girl, the one with the cut eyebrow, woke up and immediately looked at her arm, moved it in a careful arc, made a decision about it that I could read in the way she deliberately stopped favoring it, shoulders squaring, something decided and set aside. That arm was going to hurt for a while, and she had apparently determined that it would hurt quietly. The fourth girl remained still, but I could see from her breathing that she was awake, lying in the corner, looking at whatever the corner wall had to show her. Nobody pressured her. The oldest girl glanced at her once and then looked away and left her alone, which told me this too was practiced, knowing when to let the fourth girl be wherever she was. I stood up, every joint in my body made its opinion about the night known. I went to the barn door and looked out at my land. Wet grass, the north fence with its gap where I still needed to fix those posts. The house 50 yards away, smoke beginning to suggest itself from the chimney. I'd banked a fire last night and the coals had apparently survived. The road further on still muddy from the rain. Empty. I turned back to the barn. The oldest girl was watching me. We looked at each other across the barn in the morning light, and I tried to think about what I actually had, what I could actually offer, what this morning actually required. I had a house with a kitchen. I had food that was better than hardtack. I had a barn with horses that needed tending, and a fence that needed mending, and a county that had opinions about what was happening on my land. I had 4 girls who had come to my fence in the rain and had not run, which told me something about what they were running from. I jerked my head toward the house. The oldest girl looked at the house, then at the girls, then at me. I said, "There's coffee." She didn't understand the word, but she stood up. I wrote in the log quickly before we went in. They stayed the night. Now it's morning. What comes next is not going to be simple, and I have a feeling that not simple is a permanent condition from here forward. I was right about that. As it turned out, I was completely, utterly right. But not in the ways I expected. Not even close. There's a particular skill that the frontier teaches you whether you wanted to learn it or not, and it's this: how to read a room that has no language in common. I didn't know I'd learned it until that morning. Didn't know I'd been taking in information all those years. A horse's ear angle, a stranger's shoulder set, the way a man's hands change when his story changes, and cataloging it somewhere below the level of conscious thought. You don't know what you've absorbed until the normal channels are blocked, and your brain has to root around them. We came in from the barn at just past first light, and what I remember is the way the kitchen smelled to me after a night in the barn. Coffee, wood smoke, a faint trace of the dried sage I kept in a bundle by the stove, because a Navajo trader had told me it helped with sleeping, and I'd never gotten around to verifying that but couldn't quite bring myself to throw it out. And I remember thinking, this room is going to smell completely different to them. It sounds like a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. I got the fire up properly and put water on for coffee, and went to see what I had that didn't require elaborate explanation or significant cooking time. There were eggs from 2 days ago, 5 of them still good. There was cornmeal. There was a little salt pork left over from Sunday. Not a feast by any description, but food, which was the only description that currently mattered. The 4 girls stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at things. Not rudely, not with the theatrical discomfort that people sometimes perform when they're in an unfamiliar space and want you to notice they're uncomfortable. Just looking, taking inventory the way the oldest one had taken inventory of the barn, but with more variety in the expressions. The youngest one had found the window above the dry sink and was looking out at the wet yard with the specific absorbed focus of a child who has decided that a thing is interesting and will continue thinking about it until a more interesting thing appears. The 4th girl, I'd been watching her since we'd left the barn. She moved differently than the others, not slower, not more cautiously, but somehow separately, like she was carrying a slight delay between the world and her response to it. I'd seen it before in men who'd been through certain things. You learn to navigate your way around it rather than push against it. She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. Not an aggressive gesture, the opposite. More like her legs had just reached an agreement with gravity that they hadn't cleared with the rest of her. I turned back to the stove. Behind me, I heard the sound of the bench on the other side of the table, and when I glanced over my shoulder, the youngest girl had climbed up and was sitting across from the 4th one, and they were looking at each other with the particular expression of 2 people who are not going to speak, but are nonetheless conducting a conversation. The oldest girl had stationed herself near the door. Not blocking it, she'd chosen a position that gave her the door and the kitchen both, the classic orientation of someone who needs to feel the exit. I noticed she was standing on the side of the kitchen away from my rifle, which I'd left on the hooks by the front door, and I wasn't sure if that was deliberate or not. The 2nd girl, the one with the cut eyebrow, the one managing her arm, had found my row of hooks where I keep the working tools that don't go in the barn. She was looking at a pair of fencing pliers with the expression of someone who is identifying a familiar object in an unfamiliar context. I scrambled the eggs with the salt pork, made cornmeal mush because it was fast and filling and required no architecture of presentation, poured coffee into 4 mugs and put them on the table, and then, after a moment, poured a 5th for myself because I wasn't going to stand apart from this. The oldest girl came to the table when the food was on it. She sat at the end, not the head, not any position that was making a claim, just a position that let her see everything. She looked at the eggs and the cornmeal and the coffee, and then she picked up the spoon, and before she ate, she looked at each of the other 3 girls in a specific sequence. A check, an assessment. Youngest, fine, already eyeing the food with undisguised interest. 4th girl, present enough, just barely. 2nd girl, sitting down now, arm laid carefully on the table in front of her. The oldest girl ate. After that, everyone else ate. Here's what I noticed over the course of that breakfast, and what I wrote down later when I got to the log. The youngest girl ate quickly, but not sloppily. She had manners. Whatever her life had looked like before this, manners had been part of it. She tried the coffee, made a face that was privately hilarious in its precision, and then, making sure I'd seen her expression, tried it again, apparently on principle. The 4th girl ate slowly. Not reluctantly, just slowly, like she was doing it at one remove. But she ate everything she was given, and when she finished she looked up and out the window, and for a moment the delay was gone and she was just there, present, watching the rain-wet yard in the morning light. I caught that moment because I'd been watching for it, the way you watch for a break in cloud cover that you're not sure is coming. The 2nd girl ate with her good arm and managed not to make anything of the fact that she was eating with her good arm, which is a skill. Halfway through, she looked up at me and made the sign that I now knew was her gesture for her arm, not asking for anything, just acknowledging it, like she was deciding to stop pretending it wasn't there. I got up, went to the small cabinet by the dry sink where I kept basic supplies. Cloth, carbolic solution, the few things a man learns to keep if he's going to be working land alone without convenient access to a doctor. I put them on the table. The 2nd girl looked at them, then at me. I sat back down, ate a spoonful of cornmeal, deliberately looked out the window, giving her the room to decide. I heard movement, the sound of the cloth being taken from the table, a small intake of breath, the controlled kind, managing something, and then quiet. The oldest girl had watched this whole exchange with an expression that I was beginning to read better. It was. Assessment in progress, evaluation ongoing, verdict not yet delivered. I wrote in my log in the small notebook I'd brought in from the barn tucked in my breast pocket. The second girl is tending her own arm. I didn't offer to help. That seemed right. I think it was right. I'm less sure about most of my instincts this morning than I expected to be. The youngest girl had eaten everything, and was now looking at the youngest corners of the kitchen with the systematic curiosity of a child conducting research. She had found the jar of sorghum on the shelf and brought it to the table, and held it up to show the oldest girl, and the oldest girl said one word, and the youngest girl put it back immediately, but with great regret. I got up and got the sorghum and brought it back and put a small amount in the youngest girl's bowl. The oldest girl watched me do this. I said, "It's all right." She couldn't understand the words, but the youngest girl, interpreting, children are very good at interpreting the things they want to be true, immediately took the sorghum as permission and ate it with a concentration that suggested everything else had ceased to exist. The oldest girl looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something I wasn't expecting. She took the remaining sorghum and put a small amount in the bowl of the fourth girl without looking at her, just placed it there. The fourth girl looked down at it, looked at the oldest girl. Some exchange occurred that I had no access to. Then she ate the sorghum slowly like everything else. I have been alone on this ranch for 6 years. I want to be specific about what I mean by alone, because it's a word that gets used imprecisely and I prefer precision. I had ranch hands, 2 of them, Dix and a younger man we all called Pepper, who worked the main season and went south for the winter and would be back in 3 weeks. I had neighbors at a distance. I had Holt to the east and the Vasquez family to the south, and occasionally the Beaumont widow who ran the dry goods store in Canto would extend a conversation long enough to be considered social. But I'd lived in this house alone for 6 years, eaten in this kitchen alone. The table had 4 chairs because I'd bought the set without thinking when I'd first moved in, and 3 of those chairs had become a kind of ambient furniture, functional but not functional. Sitting at that table with 4 Apache girls eating my scrambled eggs and cornmeal in the rain-gray morning light was one of the strangest and most surprisingly natural things I had ever experienced. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't comfortable exactly. Comfort suggests ease, and there was nothing easy about any of it. The language barrier, the not knowing, the constant awareness of what the morning was going to eventually require in terms of decisions I didn't want to make. But it was present, real in a way that the kitchen usually wasn't, like the room had been waiting to be used this way and had finally gotten its chance. I thought about that longer than it probably deserved. After breakfast, I told them, gesturally, which was becoming a language I was improving at under pressure, that I needed to tend to the horses. This was true and also a way of giving them space, which I'd noticed they seemed to use well when they had it. The oldest girl watched me go with the assessing look. I spent about 40 minutes in the barn. Watered and fed Dusty and the 2 working horses, cleaned the stalls, did the things that needed doing. I also wrote in the log with more care than I'd been able to in the barn last night. I tried to set down what I actually knew rather than what I suspected, because the log demands that discipline and I was going to need it. 4 Apache girls, ages approximately 10, 13, 14, 16, 17, no adults, no horses, significant travel on foot evident from the youngest girl's feet and the general state of all their footwear. Injury on the second girl's arm not life-threatening, impact injury rather than cut or infection. The fourth girl's state is harder to characterize, not injured in any visible way, but something. What I don't know. Where they came from specifically. What happened to whoever was with them. Whether anyone is looking for them, and whether the anyone who's looking is looking to help or looking, because finding them serves a different purpose. I put the pen down and looked at the barn roof and thought about the army at Fort Bowie, and about the way the oldest girl had gone afraid at first light, and about the direction her hand had gestured when she'd told me about the journey. East to west, from the direction of the fort. I picked the pen back up. What I think I need to be very careful about who I talk to today, and even more careful about who I decide not to talk to. I think that these girls being here is a problem that someone made for them, not a problem they made for themselves. I think that the right thing and the easy thing are going to point in completely different directions before this day is over. I underlined that last sentence. When I came back to the house, something had changed. The fourth girl was sitting at the kitchen table and the youngest girl was across from her, and they were doing something I had to stop in the doorway to parse. The youngest girl had taken from somewhere, I wasn't sure where, a small piece of charcoal from beside the stove, and she was drawing on the back of an old feed receipt I'd left on the table. And the fourth girl was watching her. That was all, just watching her. But the delay was different. She was present in the watching, not removed. The second girl was outside. I hadn't expected that. She was standing at the edge of the yard near the south fence, looking out toward the far pasture. Her arm was wrapped. She'd used the cloth and done a reasonable job of it, from what I could see. She was just standing there with her face to the open land, and whatever she was thinking was private enough that I didn't approach. The oldest girl was in the kitchen doorway, on the inside, watching the second girl through the window. She heard me come in, turned, looked at me with the assessing expression, and then something else, something that had been there before but that I was only now reading clearly. Not suspicion, not exactly. More like she is trying to determine what kind of problem I'm going to be. I sat down at the table, opened the log, pulled out the pen. She watched me write. After a moment, she sat down across from me. Across the table, not the across of the second and fourth girls, not a shared thing, a careful, deliberate, negotiating distance. I pushed the log toward her. She looked at it, at the writing. Her expression didn't change, but she reached out and touched the edge of the page, not the writing, just the edge, with one finger. I pushed it a little further. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at me, and I had the strong impression that she understood what I was offering, which was not the content. I couldn't offer that. The language was wrong, but the gesture. The here is how I make sense of things gesture. The this is a thing I trust gesture. She put her hand flat on the page, then lifted it. Then picked up the pen I'd set beside the log. I thought she might write something, but that was a foolish thought. She wouldn't write in English, and I couldn't read Apache if it existed in written form, which I wasn't sure it did in any form I'd have encountered. Instead, she turned the log to a blank page and drew a line, not a word. A line, horizontal, moving from right to left, which was, I'd been watching for that direction, and there it was again, east to west. She drew another line, shorter, cutting across the first. Then a shape, a circle with a mark through it. She put the pen down. I looked at the page, the line going west, the cut across, the broken circle. I wrote beneath it, in English that she couldn't read, something ended. They were moving away from something that ended. The circle is a camp, a home. She watched me write without being able to read it, and there was something oddly equalizing about that. We were each working in a language the other couldn't access, and somehow we were communicating anyway, and that struck me as either very hopeful or very foolish, and possibly both. The youngest girl had looked up from her drawing. She held up the feed receipt to show the oldest girl what she'd drawn. The oldest girl looked. Something moved across her face, the quickest, most involuntary thing I'd seen from her, and then it was gone. I looked at the drawing. A small shape, rounded like a hill or a dwelling, and beside it several stick figures, a larger one, several smaller ones. And beyond them, more shapes that I couldn't quite parse except that they were different from the first shape. Harder-edged, angular. The youngest girl pointed at the stick figures and named each one. I could hear her naming them, the sound of names, the familiar cadence of this one and this one and this one. Then she pointed at the largest figure and said something that made the fourth girl, still sitting across from her and still watching, close her eyes very slowly and then open them. I looked at my log. I wrote, I need to stop acting like I have a good handle on what this is. Here's where things became complicated. Complicated is perhaps not the right word. Complicated implies a solvable puzzle with the right information. This was more like weighted. The morning had weight that was accumulating. A rider came up the road around 9 o'clock. I saw him from the kitchen window, single horse, moving at a road pace, not urgent. I recognized the horse before I could see the man. It was Holt's roan, which meant it was Holt, or one of Holt's hands, which in practice amounted to the same thing because Holt's opinions tended to travel with whoever rode under his brand. I looked at the oldest girl. She'd heard the horse too. The assessing look had returned in full, sharper than before, and she was at the window beside me before I'd moved, and she looked out and saw the rider, and I watched her read the information and file it and make a decision, all in about 3 seconds. She turned to me. made the gesture, the flat hand horizontal move west that I'd come to understand as journey movement away. Then she pointed at the girls. The question was clear. Do we run? I thought about Holt, about his opinions, about the way he talked about Apache people when he was at the feed store, which was not a way that had ever sat right with me, but which I was recognizing with some discomfort, never challenged directly. I put my hand out, palm down, stay. She looked at me. I put my hand out again, stay. Something in her face, the control, the assessment, ran up against something else. Something that wasn't controlled at all. That was just tired. A tiredness so specific and so deep that seeing it made my chest do something I wasn't expecting. She looked at the girls, then at the writer, then at me. She sat down at the kitchen table. I straightened my shirt, picked up my hat from the hook, and went out to meet Holt. Holt is Holt. He's been my neighbor for 5 years, and in 5 years we've maintained a functional neighborly relationship on the basis of avoiding most of the subjects where we don't agree, which is a larger number of subjects than either of us has ever enumerated aloud. He helped me when the creek flooded my south pasture in '91. I helped him when his roof went in the winter of '92. We are neighbors in the practical sense, which sometimes matters more than philosophy. He was friendly that morning. He pulled up at my gate and pushed his hat back and said he'd been checking on his stock after the rain and thought he'd stop by, and had I seen anything unusual. He used that word specifically. I said the rain had been a problem, but nothing else. He said he'd heard from a fellow in town that there'd been some movement out of the Eastern District. Apache families, he said. He didn't say it with his worst voice. He has a range, and this wasn't the worst end of it. But he said Apache families with a particular weight that told me what weight he'd be putting on found them if it came to that. I said I hadn't seen anyone. Holt looked at me for a moment. Holt has been around long enough to know the sound of a true answer and the sound of a careful one, and I was giving him a careful one, and I think he knew it. But he's also been around long enough to know that sometimes you don't push, especially when what you'd find by pushing isn't something you can manage comfortably. He said, all right then, said to let him know if I saw anything. Said there'd been soldiers through last night. I kept my face even, said I hadn't seen any soldiers either. He tipped his hat and turned his roan around, and I watched him go back up the road, and I stood at my gate for a full 30 seconds before I turned back to the house. When I came back inside, the oldest girl was exactly where I'd left her. She looked at me. I said, it's all right. She looked at the window, then at me. I said, he's gone. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she asked me something, not in the drawing language, the actual language, which told me the question was too complex or too important for the drawing language. I couldn't understand it. But I understood the part where she looked at me and held my gaze and waited for the answer, because that part doesn't require language. I said, I don't know yet what all right means in the bigger picture, but for right now, this morning, you're all right. She looked at me. I said I didn't tell him. She couldn't understand the specific words, but she watched my face while I said them and whatever she found there. She turned back to the table, picked up the pen I'd left beside the log, drew on the blank page a very small shape, not the broken circle from before, a different shape, something I couldn't fully read. Then she put the pen down and slid the log back toward me. I looked at the shape, wrote in the margin, I don't know what this means yet. But I kept the page. The day did what days do, it moved. I want to write that more carefully, because moved isn't quite right for what it was. The day pressed forward, the way a river presses forward when it's come up against something and is working around it, not dramatic, not in a hurry, just inexorable. Morning deepened into mid-morning, and the clouds thinned without fully clearing, and the wet yard dried enough to be workable, and the horses needed moving from the barn to the pasture, and the fence on the north side still had 3 posts that needed replacing, and the world kept presenting its practical requirements regardless of what was happening in my kitchen. I kept the girls inside. Not as a command. I wasn't under any illusion that I was making commands here. But I conveyed, as clearly as I could manage without words, that inside was safer than outside for now, and the oldest girl understood and translated whatever that meant into whatever was appropriate for the others. The youngest girl accepted this by returning to her drawing on feed receipts. The second girl accepted it by finding a corner of the kitchen to sit in and taking apart one of the hinges from the cabinet door that had been loose since spring, examining the mechanism with the total focus of someone whose hands need something to do. The fourth girl sat at the table, looked out the window, was present in her particular way, which was becoming less concerning and more specific. She wasn't gone. She was somewhere particular. I was learning to respect the somewhere. The oldest girl helped me. This was not something I'd expected, and I want to be precise about how it happened, because it wasn't offered as gratitude or deference, and I'm not going to write it as either of those things. I was getting ready to go out and do the fencing, because the fence needed doing, because practical requirements don't pause for complicated situations, and also because I needed a few minutes out of the house that weren't about Holt's visit or soldiers or the accumulated weight of a morning spent making decisions I hadn't been fully prepared to make. I was gathering the tools: wire, the claw hammer, the fencing pliers. I looked up and she was standing there with her hand out. She was looking at the fencing pliers. I handed them to her. We went out to the north fence together. I don't know what I expected. I suppose I expected to do the work and have her observe, which would have been a reasonable way for this to go. I did not expect what actually happened, which was that she took the fencing pliers and went to the first rotted post and did an assessment of the rot depth and the wire gauge that was faster and more practiced than anything I could have managed, and then held her hand out for the new post without looking at me. I gave her the post. She worked efficiently, not with the studied efficiency of someone demonstrating competence, just the actual efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows the movements. She called to me, 2 sounds, 2 syllables, when she needed the wire tension from the other side. I didn't understand the words, but understood the gesture, the way she was holding the pliers waiting for me, and I tensioned the wire and she crimped it and moved to the next post. We did the 3 posts in about 40 minutes. I could have done them in an hour and a half alone. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. The work had its own language, the language of the fence pliers and the wire and the timing of when to pull and when to hold, and we navigated it without difficulty. At some point, I noticed that the efficiency of it was making me feel something that I put into the log later as the particular satisfaction of working beside someone who is competent, compounded by how unexpected it is, compounded further by the fact that I'm not sure why I expected anything different. I wrote that last part honestly. It's a useful kind of discomfort. When we finished, she looked at the fence line, the 3 new posts. Then she looked at me and said something. The tone of it was evaluative, conclusive, the tone of someone who has completed an inspection and is reporting results. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. I stood at the fence line and wrote in the pocket log, "We fixed the fence." Then I crossed it out and wrote, "She fixed the fence. I helped." Here is where the day became something I hadn't planned for, and I want to write it carefully because in retrospect it feels like the hinge, the place where the door of that day swings. It was maybe early afternoon. I'd heated water on the stove and left it by the barn for the youngest girl's feet. The oldest had communicated this need through gesture during the fence work, efficient as everything else, no dramatization of the request, and the second girl's hinge was back on the cabinet, apparently repaired, because she was swinging the door gently and looking at it with the satisfaction of a job made right. I was at the kitchen table writing in the full log, trying to get down the morning accurately while the details were still sharp. The fourth girl spoke. Not to me, she spoke to the oldest girl who was sitting across the kitchen. And it wasn't the first words I'd heard from her. She'd said small things, necessary things over the course of the morning, but this was different in scale. It was a sustained thing. A paragraph of the Apache language with pauses and rhythm, and the oldest girl sat very still while it was being said. When the fourth girl stopped, the oldest girl didn't respond immediately. She sat still for another moment. Then she said one word, low and certain. The fourth girl looked at the table. I looked at the oldest girl. She was looking at the fourth girl with the same expression she'd had the night before in the barn when the fourth girl had been crying in the corner. The heavy, practiced expression of someone carrying something that they know they're going to keep carrying but wish, in this moment more acutely than usual, they didn't have to. I waited. Eventually, the oldest girl looked at me. She picked up the pen from the table. She'd adopted it, I noticed, the same way I'd adopted the log as a steadying object, and turned to a new page and drew again. The circle from before, the broken one. And then she drew something beside it that she hadn't drawn before, a smaller shape separate from the circle, and connected to the smaller shape a series of lines, not figures this time, not stick people, something else. Lines that might have been tracks, or roads, or the passage of something through something else. She drew, at the end of the lines, a shape I recognized. The rectangular shape with the angular marks that the youngest girl had drawn this morning. The hard-edged one, the one that wasn't the circle, wasn't the home. She put the pen down. I looked at the drawing. I looked at the fourth girl, who was still looking at the table. I looked at the oldest girl. I said very slowly, knowing she couldn't understand the words but trying to put it into my voice anyway. I understand. I didn't entirely, but I understood the direction of it. I understood the shape. I wrote in the log, the thing they left wasn't just a place. Someone is still there, or isn't there anymore, or isn't there anymore in a way that isn't a choice. I'm not going to write more specifically than that because I don't know more specifically than that, and the log should not be in the business of filling in gaps with guesses. I underlined the last line. Then I sat with it. There are moments in a life when you're given the chance to either do the thing that costs nothing and means nothing or the thing that costs something and means something. And the tricky part is that, in the moment, neither choice announces itself clearly. You only know which it was afterward. I'd been turning over the thing all day. Not consciously, not as a deliberate deliberation, but the way the mind works problems in the background while the hands are doing other things, fixing fences, scrambling eggs, watching a rider go back up a road, and standing at your gate and breathing. The soldiers Holt mentioned, the direction the girls had come from, the broken circle, the hard-edged shape at the end of a set of lines that moved west. I am not going to write in this log that I was certain of anything, because I wasn't. I'm not now. Certainty in situations like this is almost always a performance, and I'm too old for the performance. But I knew some things with enough confidence to act on them. I knew that whoever these four girls were, they hadn't chosen to walk to my fence line in the rain. They'd arrived here because a sequence of events had removed every other option. I knew that Holt's visit, and the mention of soldiers told me something about the direction the official version of this story was going to go if I didn't do something to redirect it. I knew that the oldest girl was 16 or 17, and had spent the night in my barn keeping watch over 3 younger girls, and had fixed my fence more efficiently than I could have, and had sat across my kitchen table from me and asked me, in the only language we shared, which was a language of gestures and drawings and expressions, what was going to happen. And I knew that I didn't yet have an answer. I went out to the barn in the mid-afternoon, ostensibly to check on Dusty, actually to think without the weight of the kitchen's expectations on me. I sat on the same hay bale from last night and opened the log and wrote for about 15 minutes, which for me is the equivalent of talking to myself, which I prefer not to do aloud because it feels like surrendering a dignity. What I wrote was, there are 2 problems. The first problem is what happens today, which I have some influence over. The second problem is what happens after today, which I have less influence over but am not without influence over entirely. I keep making the mistake of thinking about both at once, which means I'm not solving either. Then I wrote, so, today, what can I actually do today? And then I wrote a list, practical, specific, costs and benefits and risks, the way you think about anything that has stakes attached to it. I won't reproduce the list here, because some of it is not for this log. But the conclusion of the list was, I can get them to Vasquez. The Vasquez family, Esteban and Consuelo Vasquez, their 3 sons, and an extended household that varied seasonally, were 2 miles south of my property and had been there longer than most people in this county cared to acknowledge or credit. Esteban had been born in this territory when it was a different kind of territory, and he ran a horse operation that was good and quiet, and managed his relationships with the army and the county with a diplomacy that I'd always admired from a distance. Consuelo spoke 3 languages that I knew of, and I'd always suspected there were more. They were also the kind of people who understood the difference between a problem that was legally your problem and a problem that was morally your problem, and who had, over the decades, navigated that distinction in ways that had cost them something but had let them sleep. I went back to the house and found the oldest girl in the kitchen. I drew on the page of the log. My land, roughly, the fence on the north, the road, the barn, then south. A set of lines I intended as a trail she would recognize because she'd been moving through this landscape and I trusted her to know it better than she'd let on. Then a shape, a house shape, not the broken circle, an actual house shape with people in front of it. 2 adult figures. I pointed at the shape. She looked at it. I pointed at the girls, all 4 of them. She looked at me. I pointed at the sun through the window and then moved my hand low, approaching the horizon, before dark. She looked at the drawing again, then out the window at the road, then at me. She said something. The tone of it was the one I'd come to identify as the assessing a risk tone, careful and not hostile but precise. She pointed at the road. I shook my head, made a gesture around, not the road, a different path. She thought about this. The youngest girl had come in from wherever she'd been and was looking at the drawing on the table. She said something to the oldest girl, a question. The oldest girl answered without looking away from me. I waited. The oldest girl picked up the pen. Drew one thing on the page, a shape I'd have to think about to interpret. A small round thing, and beside it, a line curving upward like a question. She pointed at the shape, then at me. What are you was what I thought it meant. Or why, or both. I took the pen, drew slowly because I wasn't entirely sure what I was drawing until it was done, a man. Then beside the man, 4 figures, smaller. Then I drew between the small man figure and the group of 4, a small horizontal shape. A log, a pen. I drew the man writing in the log. She looked at it for a long time. The 4th girl had come in at some point, I hadn't noticed when. She was standing in the doorway. She looked at the drawing, then at me. And then, for the first time, with nothing in front of it, no particular moment that seemed to precipitate it, she looked at me directly and said, in accented but recognizable English, 1 sentence. We will go where you say. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. I looked at her. She was looking back at me with the same quality she'd had all day, the somewhere particular quality, but now it was meeting me at the surface. I said, okay. She nodded once, looked at the oldest girl, said something in Apache. The oldest girl looked at her for a moment that had something complicated in it, something that might have been relief, or might have been its own kind of grief, the kind that comes when something you've been holding is finally, briefly, shared. Then the oldest girl looked at me and gave a single, precise nod. We left the house at 3 o'clock. I won't describe the route in detail in this log, not because I don't remember it, but because specificity about routes seems unwise. The territory between my land and the Vasquez property has washes and ridgelines and stands of mesquite, and juniper that an experienced person can move through quickly and without being visible from the road, and the 4 girls were experienced in ways I was only beginning to understand. We moved fast. The youngest girl's feet were better. The warm water had helped, and I'd found a pair of old wool socks that were large but more substantial than what she'd been wearing. But she didn't complain, not once, and I found that I kept looking at her and recalibrating my sense of what 10 years old could carry. The 2nd girl kept pace. The arm was wrapped. She moved it carefully but moved it, doing what she'd decided she was going to do with it. The 4th girl moved beside me about a half step back, and at one point we were crossing through a wash where the mud was still soft from the rain. She said quietly in English, "It is far." I said not too far, maybe 20 minutes. She nodded, said nothing else. I looked at her sideways. She was looking ahead at the ridgeline. The delay was gone. She was fully here, fully present, in the way of someone who has decided that here and now is where they're going to be. I said, "Do you speak much English?" She said, "Enough." Then my mother spoke it. I didn't push that. I wrote it in the pocket log, walking, which is illegible later, but that's what the margin is for. Consuelo Vasquez met us at the south end of the Vasquez property. I don't know how she knew we were coming. She told me later that she'd seen me heading south from the upper kitchen window and had a notion. But I think Consuelo's notions operated on frequencies I wasn't equipped to fully track. She looked at the girls, and her face did something specific and immediate that was the adult version of the 2nd girl catching the 4th girl's elbow in the mud the night before, a practiced, ready, available thing. She said something in Spanish, and then immediately switched to something else that I had to look twice to recognize as Apache. Not fluent, halting, careful, but real. The oldest girl looked at her. A long look that ran the assessment and came back with something I'd have described as not trust exactly. Trust was going to take time and experience and probably more than 24 hours, but acceptable terms for beginning. Consuelo looked at me. She said, "How long have you had them?" I said, "Since last night." She said, "You should go back now." I said, "I know." She said, "If anyone asks, you haven't seen anything since the storm." I said, "That's what I told Holt." She looked at me for a moment, and then she did something she'd never done before in 5 years of neighboring. She put her hand briefly on my arm. 1 second, maybe 2. Then she turned back to the girls. I looked at the oldest girl. She was looking at me. The assessment was there, but underneath it, and this is the thing I've had trouble writing in the log because I'm not sure my words are going to be accurate. Underneath, it was something that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't gratitude, because gratitude implies that what I'd done was a gift, and what I'd done was the minimum that the situation required of a person who intended to keep looking at himself. It wasn't softness. It was a kind of acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone who has seen what a person is made of under conditions that reveal things and has reached a verdict. I don't know if the verdict was good. I hope it was close to good. I said, "I don't know your name, not really. I wrote something down, but I know it's wrong." The fourth girl who was standing near me said something to the oldest girl, a short phrase. The oldest girl looked at the fourth girl, then at me. She said her name, the actual sound of it, not a phonetic approximation of what I'd been carrying around in the log, the real thing, which is a different animal. I tried to repeat it. She didn't correct me. Maybe it was close enough, maybe it doesn't matter. I said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." The fourth girl translated this, or something like it, and the oldest girl listened and looked at me and said, one word in English. The only English I heard from her in the entire duration of this. She said, "Yes." I walked back alone. The territory between the Vasquez property and my land takes about 20 minutes at a reasonable pace, and I spent most of that walk doing the thing I do when I can't stop my brain, which is narrate. I run through what happened and I try to see the shape of it. Not to judge it, the log is not a court, and I'm not a judge, but to see it accurately, which is the next best thing. Here's what I saw. 4 girls had come to my fence in the rain. I'd given them the barn, and then the house, and then the table, and then the food, and then the fence work, and then, in the afternoon, a route south through the washes to a place that was safer than my kitchen was going to continue to be. This is the accounting. This is what I had done. What I had not done, I had not gone to Holt. I had not gone to town. I had not sought the army at Fort Bowie, who was the official answer to the official version of what this situation was. I had not done those things, and I knew, walking back through the wet mesquite with the sun dropping toward the ridgeline, that not doing them was a kind of choice with a kind of weight that I would be carrying forward. I did not feel bad about it. I noted that I did not feel bad about it, and I tried to understand what that meant, and what it meant was that I was still uncertain about many things, but not that thing. That thing had resolved. I found that interesting. I got home before dark. Went directly to the barn. Dusty looked at me with the resigned acknowledgement of an old horse who has accepted that her owner's sleeping habits are his problem and not hers. I sat on the hay bale, opened the full log to a new page. I wrote for about an hour. I wrote everything. The fence line and the rain and the hardtack and the coffee and the sorghum for the youngest girl and the hinge the second girl had repaired, and the drawing that said broken circle and the things I'd been trying to avoid knowing, and the conversation with Holt at the gate, and the walk south in the afternoon. I wrote about the fourth girl saying enough when I'd asked if she spoke English, and about the word that meant my mother, and about the oldest girl saying yes. I wrote, I don't know what happened to the things the broken circle represented. I don't know where they'll go from Vasquez's. I don't know if the thing I did today was enough, or what enough would even look like in a situation that I don't have the full context for and probably never will. But I know what the morning looked like in my kitchen. I know what 4 people eating at a table I'd thought was permanent furniture looks like. I know what a fence repaired by someone who understood the work looks like. I know what it looks like when a person who has been carrying something for too long says yes. I think that's what changed. Not anything I did. Not any decision I made or any particular act of whatever this was. Kindness is too small a word, and heroism is an offense to what they were carrying. What changed was that I saw something clearly that I'd been keeping in the soft focus you apply to things that are easier at a distance. They had names, they had skills. They had loyalty to each other that I'd have been hard-pressed to replicate in any group of people I've known for years. They had a youngest girl who ate sorghum like it was the most consequential experience of her morning, and the oldest girl who gave it to her without hesitation. They had a fourth girl who was somewhere else all day, and then came back and said yes in English, which was a bridge she built in real time because the situation required it. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what happens next. I put the pen down. Dusty sighed in her stall. Outside, something moved in the scrub, the possum or the night bird again, or something different. It was hard to say. I looked at the hay bale across from mine, the one where the oldest girl had sat all night in the low lantern light, watching the door and watching her hands, and giving out blankets before she kept any for herself. I left the lantern where it was for a while. The mockingbird, the same one, I think, or one that had taken up the same post, was going somewhere to the south. A complicated, borrowed song, assembled from everything it had heard and made into something it could keep. I picked up the pen. I wrote the last line of the entry, and then I closed the log and sat in the barn in the half-dark. And I didn't try to resolve it, because some things are not built for resolution. The night settled in. I sat with what the morning had changed, and I let it be changed, and I didn't write any more.